well, we tiny time. We will have 15 to a maximum of 20 minutes for every presentation, each of the presentations. Then no questions allowed at that point. I will give my commentary, also about 15 minutes or so, and then we will have a discussion of all the three papers plus the commentary. And we will follow basically the given order. That means that Perrin will be starting with his presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you also to the local and the global committee that put this together. It looks like a tremendous amount of work, and I'm very happy that you decided to host it in Barcelona. We've had a great time here, and seems to be going very smoothly. And also to everybody who sent in a paper. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from them all. I'm going to try and stick with the theme so far of kind of staying at a more the level of argument and more abstract than giving a real empirical paper, and kind of begin by sort of reminding you what my paper was about, and then give you some more specific arguments about how I think the Cold War works in the particular context I'm working at. I'm going to try and kind of build on Kriege's paper a little bit, but I think that the context in which I'm looking at the Cold War is extremely different, and the same questions he asks have very different answers in the environment I'm looking at, which is the global international communities centered around the United Nations organizations. My basic argument is that the international community, the UN system, was a critical space for the construction of what I'm calling Spaceship Earth, and what my actors ended up calling Spaceship Earth in the late 1960s, this sort of global view from above of an interdependent, isolated, fragile environment. And I look at this in the 25 years following World War II. It's basically, in STS jargon, the co-production of the global environmental knowledge and international knowledge infrastructure, the international institutions of the UN and their associated bodies, which I'll talk about a little bit more. In some ways, as I write in the paper, I think of it almost as a counterfactual history, because this history that we have and is sort of common sense knowledge about how we acquired all this knowledge of the global environment in particular really is a Cold War story, and has been told as a Cold War story dominantly, especially in terms of military patronage to understand hard to get to environments like the bottom of the ocean and the high atmosphere and the Arctic zones that were extremely expensive to get to, and also nuclear anxieties about the fears of fallout and atomic weapons and the pollution and tracking all those things have really been a motivating factor and a key. The military and this sort of knowledge has been a key patron in acquiring that sorts of knowledge, and Ron Dole has done as much as anybody to sort of lay out that story for us, but also Alison Kraft's piece that we're reading about here with nuclear fallout speaks to that. Simona is going to talk about NATO and that sort of institutional context, and Jacob Hamblin, who couldn't be here, but is very much, I feel like, sort of present at the conference. He also has done a lot to tell that story, and I certainly don't want to say that isn't a valid story. So I'm telling another part of this story that also I think is important. It's also a counterfactual in terms of talking about the post-war political economy, because I think of the post-war political economy in sort of a common sense terms of this endless growth, this a political economy of more that dominated certainly the US political and cultural context, and also to some extent the international context. And it's associated with Vannevar Bush and the science and the endless frontier vision. And one of the ironies that I enjoy about telling this story is that the endless frontier really did manifest itself in the space race and the program, and shooting literally outside of the Earth's frontier into space. And for many people, when they then looked back on the Earth, they didn't celebrate this endless frontier. Instead, they had great anxieties about living on this small, isolated, interdependent, fragile environment. It made them aware of the limits of growth that come out at the exact same time as this is happening. So I want to tell the story of why they saw the world that way, and how that contributed to the construction of the global environment. The UN system that I look at is very easy to mock. And I must say, the deeper you get into the archives, into the reading, the easier it gets to mock, actually. And the people who worked in the UN wrote very witty things mocking their own institutional environment. The incompetence and the lack of funds and the petty bureaucratic politics are very real. At the same time, it's been surprisingly important, and the more I've researched into it, the more I've been surprised at how important this institutional context was for creating a global knowledge. In part, this is because creating global knowledge requires local observations in different nations in particular. And you can, if you've read it, and if you haven't, you should, I think. Paul Edwards' book on A Vast Machine really speaks to this, and he talks about making global data, which he describes as collecting observations from all around the world. You can't do it all with satellites. There's people on the ground, and depending on what kind of resource you're looking at, you might have to dig a hole in a specific place to know what's there. And he also talks about making data global, which is getting all those local observations standardized so that they speak to each other and can be synthesized. And that takes creating international standards, international norms for making those observations, international categories for what you're going to observe. It actually requires, it turns out, experts to be understanding themselves as participating in a common project, and in some sense buying into common narratives about how environmental change happens, how economic growth will come to be. And it, in the end, creates transnational communities by creating these global standards and norms. So I look at international mapping projects, surveys, inventories, social surveys, opinion polling, indexes of standards of living, and those sorts of things to see how the global environment was created. And I think the stakes in doing that kind of historical research, particularly in the United States, less in Europe, are important because the UN organizations have been fairly well excluded from the Cold War historiography. And they did matter. And if we're going to have policies that speak to, that take advantage of more international, transnational institutions, we have to take their history seriously. And at the same time, there's a way that it's a passing phase now, but that the non-governmental transnational can be celebrated in sort of naive ways that don't speak to its limitations, tensions, and contradictions that we can learn from history. The period I look at is from basically the late 1940s to the early 1970s. I can think of it as bounded by two conferences. In 1949, there was a United Nations Scientific Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources, which is right at the beginning of the Technical Assistance Program in the international community, and ends in about 1972, when there's this United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. This period is the heart of Cold War historiography, really. But for me, the more I've looked at it, the more it seems like a continuous intellectual history with the interwar period. The looking back looks like a more continuous history than the break in 1972. Or it's not 72 exactly, but sometime in the early 1970s and going through that decade in the 1970s. That is that this seems like more of an ending, a culmination of a process. And the intellectual history certainly goes into the interwar period even more. And just thinking about the last comments on the last panel, as the Cold War continues, the sense I got was that the Cold War bureaucratic structures continued in this. Jessica talked about this food security and that sort of thing continuing from the Cold War, that kind of language and understanding. I think that's true, but of course it also really starts with World War II, as well as the regulatory regimes of knowledge and these sorts of things. And even before the Cold War had congealed, food security was understood in these sorts of terms. In some sense, what we see is the manifestation during this period that I'm looking at of a vision of scientific conservation that was present at the beginning. This UNSCR, the United Nations Scientific Conference on the Conservation Utilization of Resources, was the brainchild of Gifford Pinchot, who's the kind of founding father of conservation in the United States. So and J.D. Bernal, a British kind of communist scientist, also had a vision of an international regulatory regime for resources. And so you can kind of see that this is manifesting their vision, and that they were able to instill this in the international community. But of course, they had to tailor it to work in the international community. They had to craft their narratives and create their knowledge so that it was politically viable. And for the particular political environment of this international community, and to do that, I just mentioned in the paper that you really need to think about the United Nations organizations on 3 different levels. There's this sort of first UN of national governments, which is these general conferences and loud debates that go on there. There's a second UN of the international secretariats, with international civil servants working there, and intense bureaucratic politics between these UN agencies, these specialized agencies like the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, are the 2 that I look at most closely. And then there's a third UN of NGOs and universities and independent experts that are also a critical and integral part of this community. So you see national governments, international agencies, and this NGO world is really co-constitutive. The board boundaries are porous, and whatever knowledge they produce has to work for all 3 different communities. So it's an intense negotiation that goes on. I will just give you one example from the very beginning period. There's an argument over, for these environmental scientists and the conservationists over preservation versus conservation, kind of a classic environmental argument about how you're going to manage these regimes. And they are extremely strategic and explicit in talking about this, about the fact that a preservationist argument will not appeal to national governments, so we need to embed preservation within a utilitarian conservationist argument. And so you have figures like Julian Huxley, who's very interested in what we now would call biodiversity, talking about game preserves as providing protein for natives. You have William Vaught, who's this road to survival population kind of alarmist character who's a big figure in this period of time, who's also an ornithologist, very interested in nature in that sort of preservationist sense, really putting his argument in these utilitarian terms. And in some sense, this is a debate that's going on between a sort of a colonial experts context and a European domestic expert context, where the colonial and the American vision of resource conservation really wins out over a preservationist vision. While they were interested in promoting prosperity in these utilitarian terms, many of these experts were primarily motivated by peace, though, coming out of World War II. And they were really motivated by internationalism as their motivating factor. They thought of development as a moral equivalent of war, in William James's terms. That this was a project that would unite people across national boundaries to solve problems that inherently crossed national borders. So in Amanda McVetie's paper about Rinderpest, we see this, they would particularly look for problems that would require international solutions and frame them in those ways. They talked about a world community and world citizenship. This is really behind the whole project of this, and it was developed into a very formal political science theory called functionalism. These are the UN functional organizations, and their goal is to slowly build up an international infrastructure for a world government. It's kind of embarrassing to say at this point, but that is really the goal of motivating their work. The apolitical quality of science is really a key political resource, and it's understood explicitly in those terms. The international effectiveness of these scientists, however, is completely dependent on their national standing. You cannot be an effective internationalist unless you're taken seriously in your national context and by your national government. And so that is as Paul Foreman has written about a lot, or importantly, that is a key component of this internationalism. Moving just to the Cold War and the influence on the Cold War environment on the international scientific community. I would just talk briefly about its effects. One thing that we see is this sort of sequestration of topics that are caused by the Cold War. So the stuff that John is talking about is really removed from this UN context. They don't deal with the nuclear physics in the same way. There's separate agencies created to deal with atomic science. but much of this is removed from the normal UN system. There's a conscious move away from focusing directly on peace, which is the original vision of how these UN specialized agencies are going to work. They're going to work for peace. I hardly even know what that means anymore, to working on development, because of the Cold War, I would say. Because working on peace and working on Cold War issues is not possible. They have to ramp up the rhetoric of sort of this Malthusian resource crisis in order to compete with the anxieties of the atomic bomb. So a typical paragraph in one of these projects would begin by talking about the atomic threat and then comparing that to the population bomb from the early 1950s on. So kind of an increase in this sort of rhetoric. And it increases the importance of the natural sciences, especially the environmental sciences, agricultural sciences in UN work, and makes other sorts of work like the social sciences very difficult to pursue because of the tensions in ideological debate. So it's no coincidence that when the first Soviet program director was appointed, he was appointed to the Natural Sciences Division of UNESCO. The Soviet Union actually wanted to put somebody in the Education Department or the Social Sciences Department, and the United States said no. Even though the Social Sciences Department is perceived as a mess and incompetent and not effective, it's too politically sensitive an area to have a Soviet. Whereas putting a soil scientist in there, this is seen as a non-political position. Counterintuitively, the Cold War limited the superpower influence in the UN system. The Soviets were absent from the first conference I talk about, and they were absent from the second conference I'm talking about in Stockholm. They never joined the Food and Agriculture Organization. But both the US and the USSR, both countries, the internal security clearance processes, the logistics of the Loyalty Act, and that sort of suspicions of internationalism in both countries made it very difficult for American experts often to participate in this program. It made it very difficult in both countries to host international conferences. And it had not straightforward and unpredictable effects on individuals' careers, I would say. At the same time, especially in the United States and during the McCarthy era, the interrogations, the security clearance processes, the blacklisting of experts of American experts in working in the UN was a rallying force that congealed a sense of real international identity in the civil service of the United Nations. So they defined themselves against American sort of power in that way, and formed their international, basically, union of civil servants directly in opposition to these loyalty hearings. Neither government was very effective at using UN agencies in their Cold War strategies, and both governments were obsessed with how they could use the UN in these ways, and they weren't very effective. So if you told a history of the UN agencies by just going to the general conferences and the official proceedings of these conferences, it would look as if much of it was dominated by Cold War rhetoric. But these are very performative, predictable, tedious arguments, actually. At the levels of the second UN, the International Secretariat, and the non-governmental organizations, very little of that really filters down. If anything, it provides, again, a sort of a motivating factor and gives meaning to the scientists' lives who are able to cooperate across the Iron Curtain boundary. And in a sense, it ends up increasing the importance of non-governmental actors in the UN, because since the UN agencies turned out not to be very effective agencies in the Cold War battle, they took their advice from, the university professors and independent experts who were there. The decolonization and regional tensions had a much bigger impact on the UN programs than the Cold War, I would say. That's very clear. I just want to make two quick comments on American hegemony and self-sufficiency that Kriege talked about in his paper. Well, as I said, much of the UN and the way it's perceived is designed to kind of manage and laundry the problem of US power, to democratize it because it manifests these liberal norms of knowledge making. So that knowledge making is supposed to be democratized, and geographic representation of experts is incredibly important. And there's great fears of US cultural imperialism, so that US experts are often involved in setting up international unions in the sciences, in both the social and the natural sciences, but they play more ceremonial roles and more connections to funding sources, and European scientists have a much bigger role. On the advisory committees that run all of these programs, there's often a key US figure, but other actors are more interested and have more invested in their careers and really participating in those programs. So you do see the self-sufficiency of the US intellectual economy really downplaying the role of American experts in the international community, although they play key roles. And then I will just, one last comment on Cold War and development in general. Michael Addis has made this argument that there was sort of a convergence between Soviet development policy and American development policy in terms of what they offered third world countries. And I think this is very true, that the programs actually look very different in terms of what are being offered to third world countries. And he decries this as sort of not creating enough opportunities or not very many alternatives for third world countries themselves. In my view, it shows the power of this sort of third world context because both the Soviet Union and the United States really were telling the third world leaders what they wanted to hear. And so that's sort of one way that this sort of limiting thing happens. And this development narratives that they're working in have much longer histories, and certainly coming out of the colonial context are kind of an ongoing story in which the United States and the Soviet Union then feed into and participate in. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Perrin, for a very stimulating paper, also for sticking to the given time frame, and in particular for, well, I think trying to link your paper to both the introductory papers and the other papers in the air. We all had the opportunity to read the papers in advance, and we have all read all the papers, so there is already kind of a dialogue which you have emphasized, and I think that's a particular rewarding mode of discussion, not just to present your papers, but try to find links to the other papers, and the same effort, hopefully, we will get from Matthew on military science and slow violence in the Canadian Arctic.
Two, perhaps. Thanks very much to the organizers for putting this conference together. It's really exciting for me to be here in this wonderful city for the first time. It's a privilege to be in the room with scholars who I've been learning from for over a decade, and a pleasure to meet new colleagues. In my time this morning, I have two ambitions. First, I'd like to situate my fairly specific paper within a larger set of problems and questions, and in so doing, draw closer to the objectives of the conference, perhaps. Second, I'd like to add some visual evidence. I should say as well that I'm somewhat of an interloper in the history of science. My interest broadly is in the military production of geographical knowledge, which of course is not altogether dissimilar, and its contexts and consequences. And however we see the Cold War here this weekend, I'd like to suggest by way of a beginning that perhaps counterintuitively, the military dimensions of Cold War science and engineering require more attention. This, of course, is also a transnational and global history as well, and there's interesting ways in which we can think transnational histories of science alongside, say, histories of military globalism. In the most direct sense, this paper is part of a collaborative book project on the history of the distant early warning, or DEW line, something I've been working on for a long time. The papers focus on the Military Sea Transportation Service, or MSTS, and my emphasis on logistics is part of a section of this book that addresses the conception, siting, and construction of the line. And this is a project whose scale is difficult to exaggerate. In Canada, at least, the consequences of this huge Cold War initiative are still very much present. As I note in the paper, over the last decade, the remnants of the DO line have been targeted by a massive $500 million effort, possibly much more, undertaken by contractors and local residents to remove debris and decontaminate sites rife with toxic waste. The focus in this particular section of the book is on the roles played by specific individuals, institutions, corporations, including MSTS, but also particularly Western Electric, the manufacturing and supply arm of the many-tentacled Bell system. So crafting these enduring sets of military structures resulted in, but was also premised on a fundamental reconfiguration of Arctic environments. This reconfiguration was in some respects focused specifically on these DO line sites, but it ultimately represented a systematic alteration of the southern, very much in quotes, human presence on northern sea and terrain. So my aim in the paper, in the project, is to situate this physical and technical labor alongside an equally significant imaginative revaluation of Arctic geography. How these handlers of the DO line approached the North, how they were trained to understand it, how they saw and described it in both distant and more grounded ways, was inextricable from their numerous northern activities during a very brief period when extraordinary power was bestowed upon and exercised by their employers, by MSTS or Western Electric, for instance. So as Edward Jones Imhotep puts it in a rare discussion of northern research after the Second World War, and he's specifically talking about employees of Canada's radiophysics laboratory who traveled to Churchill, Manitoba to study auroral displays. He says visions of a remote and isolated region were in fact underwritten by the assertions of science. And that's very much a quote that animates my paper. And in this paper, I use a number of comments and quotations from MSTS publications and films. It's the first paper I've written where I actually use YouTube as a significant source, which is somewhat embarrassing, perhaps. Treating the North, these quotes really treat the North as a wasteland or a wilderness, as an environmental challenge for the employees of the MSTS, and I could cite many more similar examples. And these are, as I note, very unsurprising characterizations of the North. They're hardly limited to the DO line case, but it's interesting to think about the ways in which they've been durable and consequential. According to a leader of the recent remediation effort, the Canadian remediation effort, he said it was remote, hardly anyone lived there, these sites were in the middle of nowhere, far from anyone's imagination, and therefore the environment wasn't at the fore. The more important point, though, is that this sort of historical and geographical distancing should be treated with skepticism. Sorry, I've skipped a slide here. This idea of the mysterious North, to borrow the term of the popular, I'm going to go right back to the beginning, to borrow the popular Canadian historian Pierre Burton, who wrote a book of the title in 1956. This is a realm of tremendous significance in North America during the 1950s. And elsewhere too, even as it was and is still treated as a distinct social and environmental region. It's imperative that we challenge such exercises in strict boundary making, to draw the Arctic inside the horizon of Cold War science, for instance. So it's precisely for these reasons that the history that concerns me here is not an exclusively northern history. I think that would be a tremendous mistake. Nor is the North particularly easy to fix in the genealogy of something as simultaneously monumental and dispersed as the DO line. This history must extend beyond radar stations and adjacent communities to a sprawling set of bases and boardrooms and field sites and laboratories, even to the pages of periodicals and the footage of newsreels. In these locations, powerful forms of geographical knowledge, along with elements of the line itself, were being generated, debated, and tested. To speak of the Cold War transformation of the North, then, means blurring the materiality of places with their discursive counterparts and requires movement across a range of scales and relationships. Okay. The case of the DO line, and specifically its initial implementation, helps us to think about two terms that travel across the spectrum of scholarship in Cold War science: high modernism and technopolitics. The line was consistently treated by its champions as an unprecedented and masterful achievement in the long human struggle with a forbidding Arctic environment. As other work in the history of science, historical geography, and environmental history suggests, such epic assertions were made possible by the more specific efforts of engineers, planners, and related workers who established and maintained the conduit between local and detached knowledge of northern geography. And here I'm thinking of work by people like my UBC colleague Tina Liu. This role and the authority granted to it allowed the line and the North as a whole to be treated in technical terms as a space for the receipt of devices and practices perfected in a laboratory setting. High modernism was not a strictly Cold War concept, of course, but the planetary dimensions of that conflict, the gathering power of multiple military-industrial complexes, and the particular conflation of technoscience and geopolitics spawned by the Manhattan Project, all contributed to the belief that a megaproject such as the DO line was both attainable and necessary. The taming of northern nature, however challenging for DO line planners, was in one sense only a minor and late stage in a series of governmental moves that fused science and security during the 1940s and 1950s. Dreamed and designed in laboratories designed by their patrons as contributors to the field of safety engineering, the line was a mere component, if a significant one, of a massive new defense network, treated as a manageable system precisely because this terminology countered the profound uncertainty of the Cold War. The DO line was a particular type of high modernist endeavor. It was treated as a technical solution to a military dilemma, and as such represented the dual mid-century optimism in both technology and state authority, a faith channeled into the Cold War competition for the dominance of terrestrial and extraterrestrial space. And unlike most of the high modernist examples introduced by James Scott and many others in his wake, the DO line was not an explicitly social project. Its proponents and producers devoted a tiny fraction of their energy to the consequences of radar construction for actual northern people. Even so, as a new communications network, a demonstration of apparent environmental mastery, a source of wage income for certain northerners, a repository of southern expertise and cultural practices in the Arctic, and a shield built to secure North American social life, the line was irrefutably an exercise in modernization. Moreover, the creation of the Cold War Continental Defense Network, with the DO line at its geographical edge, certainly involved what Gabriel Hecht describes as the displacement of power onto technical things. It's necessary then to consider how continental defense technology was designed or used to enact political goals, but also how the material of the DO line, as it was conceived and put in place, led to unpredictable results. I think the crucial hinge here is the relationship between the expert perfection, if you like, of radar devices at locations like MIT's Lincoln Lab, and their subsequent conversion into what you might call field-ready combat tools, capable of being operated by military personnel, really with only limited scientific training. And this is why agencies like MSTS and Western Electric are so interesting and so important, because they really manage and translate this relationship. So much of the northern work carried out by such organizations was premised on attempts to apply consistent learned practices in a distinctly different environment. The North, as many visitors expressed both informally and directly, was itself a kind of laboratory for science, engineering, military exercises. These sorts of statements about the North as a laboratory, which recur over and over again, imply geographic distinction, but they also imply, of course, a certain confidence of universality, backed by a clear political mission. This test of men and machines, as one person put it, was just that, an opportunity to further the reach of a techno-political worldview. According to a typical account in North, which was a magazine produced by Canada's Department of Northern Affairs and National Resources, from the trials and related work, it was concluded that the practical DO line could be built across the— despite rigorous climatic conditions and difficult supply routes. So with construction nearly completed in the spring of 1957, over 1 million tests were performed to prove out the system to satisfaction. So this, you see in this language that the DO line is quickly and consistently presented as a logistical matter of overcoming environmental challenges. If political questions entered into this description, they have either been settled beforehand or are simply negated by the realization of technical success. I should say as well that if success is defined over and over again in these technical terms, these techno-political terms, it's obviously nonetheless made in very improvisational, intimate, and even awkward ways. And there are many, many examples of this, of workers having a great deal of difficulty, for instance, in actually putting this system together. But the many promotional publications associated with the project featured a more triumphant rendering, and this is something that you encounter in the study of military science, is this kind of endless chain of triumphal language. And I want to try and think about this as a kind of predicament for historical scholarship, that we need to acknowledge this triumphal language of Cold War technoscience, but also, I think, take it seriously to some extent. Smooth progress, the enormous scale, the arrival of modernity in the North, as is seen in such rhetoric, these elements were really put together, fused with the aid of a new military technology, if you like, and that is the science of logistics, at least as the particular choice that I've made in this paper. Logistics allows the North to be, quote, conquered by degrees, ruled ultimately by a generic, dispassionate DO line radar station and its southern workers with their southern tools and intelligence. And yet at the same time, it's ultimately up on the DO line that all of these factors come together. In the words of a Western Electric manager, to form a single, closely integrated team, welded together by the sense of the urgency of the job. And I love that language as a kind of epitomization of Cold War military science. So for all of the hyperbole in the language of accomplishment, the Arctic and its identity as a proving ground for military experimentation were never quite far from view. This was a northern story. So if we fast forward to 2012 as a kind of continued attempt to move past some of the ostensible boundaries of the Cold War, and we find thousands of bags filled with contaminated soil waiting to be removed from places like Cape Dyer in Nunavut. This is really a dramatic reminder of the legacies of high modernism, of Cold War military science, and of what I borrow from Rob Nixon in the paper to call slow violence. So how do we understand this story and this kind of epilogue to a Cold War project? I think it's too simplistic to ascribe this recklessness to the remoteness of the North, this idea simply that the North was distant, without first understanding how this distancing was manufactured. There's also a very interesting story, of course, and it's very much one that we take up in the book, about the role of indigenous Northerners, placed either precariously at the edges or completely outside of the technical and logistical geography of the Arctic. They're strikingly absent from many of the studies that prepare the ground for the implementation of the line's infrastructure. At best, they are treated as a small but valuable reservoir of labor which is acclimated to the Arctic zone, baffled at first by modern machines and construction methods, but, quote, quick to catch on. But of course, while many of the Arctic's indigenous communities were unalterably altered by the routines of this techno-political exercise, this process was not one of unidirectional assimilation. And here we want to kind of check the power of Cold War science, I think, a little bit. So as students of Cold War science, we frequently encounter comments like the one uttered by a DO line project manager back in 1957. The initiative, he said, was a full-scale attack on the Arctic unparalleled in military history, one that would play a major role in keeping alive a way of life. And I've tried to suggest here and in the paper that we can and should use such individuals and their employers in our histories of Cold War science. In my case, scientific work carried out as part of an invigorated encounter between the state and a northern environment. So while undoubtedly hyperbolic, such language is also extremely suggestive, because it points to another set of complicated, lived, and much more messy histories that are all the more consequential for their geographic specificity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for a great paper, also for providing us with the visuals, which are in a way telling and also necessary to understand what you meant by, well, transforming the North into a kind of military scientific landscape. We move on to Simone, who is in these days, weeks, and months very much occupied with organizing the International Congress for the History of Science, which many of us will be participating later on this year. But he nevertheless provided us with two papers, one already published and another one which came in late. But I think we all read it and we well prepared for your presentation, Simone.
Thank you very much, Helmut, and I must say I feel a little bit uncomfortable sitting down. It's not something that I like to do when I'm presenting, but anyway, I'll stick to the norms, and I will start with this paper, which is really a case study about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why NATO? I think, this paper resonates with some of the themes that have been presented earlier, in particular with the idea that we should rethink probably about the Cold War as a global conflict where many actors were present, and we should probably go beyond the traditional narrative of two scorpions in a bottle. Probably there were more than two scorpions there. But another thing that I wanted to say is probably that we should also think absolutely, I definitely buy, and I try to illustrate what John Krieger was telling us about the introduction of flexible methods that would bring together classified knowledge and unclassified knowledge in very functional ways rather than put them in opposition. I think many American planners by the 1950s had a clear sense that the kind of model that had been developed during the Manhattan Project was no longer applicable in the moment in which the conflict was becoming globalized, in the moment in which international relations were far more important and needed to innovate that kind of mechanism. I would probably synthesize this with saying that it was really a shift from the traditional need-to-know criterion to a need-to-know-more criterion. That said, probably just introduce briefly some of the aspects of the project of which the case study I'm going to present today is part of, which is the Earth Under Surveillance. This is a project funded by the European Research Council. It marks a very important and pioneering collaboration between leading history of science centers in Europe, amongst others those of Strasbourg, Pierre and Marie Curie in Paris, and Autónoma University in Barcelona. We have several postdocs, PhD candidates, collaborators. The project really explores the development of the earth sciences in Europe, especially during the Cold War period, and in particular focuses on issues of patronage. Among some of its methodological features, you can see the idea of a transnational approach primarily, the idea of combining together archival sources and oral history interviews from several countries in order to produce really an account that goes beyond and across national boundaries and look at the circulation of knowledge in greater detail. I think probably the most original feature of the whole project is this idea of trying to understand the development of the rise of the geosciences in Europe and elsewhere in the light of the interplay between the geosciences and surveillance programs. If I want to explain what do we mean by geosciences on the one side and surveillance on the other, I probably should use the words of one of my collaborators in the project, Peter Roberts, who actually noticed that the knowledge of the environment is conducive of more knowledge of the enemy during the Cold War. The idea that actually the environment ultimately can be used to gain more information about enemy forces, enemy capabilities, enemy resources, and therefore it is exactly that interconnection between those who are concerned with surveillance, intelligence operators, intelligence agencies, and those experts that can offer knowledge and ways to gain that knowledge that is conducive to know more about the enemy, that brings them together to collaborate. is a way, is an interpretation. I think is original, is innovative. If you don't like it, well, we can discuss about it. There you can see how we articulate in several strands this kind of idea, looking first of all about resources, prospecting strategies, and how the search for strategic resources, such as oil and uranium, brought some of these actors together. We then move on to consider how the monitoring of nuclear programs also bring these actors together, as well as the study of a number of features of the Earth, the oceans, the atmosphere, the polar regions would also bring these actors together. And we want to actually track the legacy, ultimately, of that amount of environmental knowledge that was put together into modern analysis of environmental change. What has changed in terms of science policies? What has changed in terms of transfer of knowledge from that kind of surveillance-oriented environmental research to more recent research that probably has a kind of more environmentalist flavor, has at the heart the idea of preservation, conservation. Why is that? What has been left in the pages of history? What has been brought forward? There you can see some of my collaborators. Some are here, so you can talk with them if you want, Nestor and Lino, for instance, about the projects. Some are not here. I think this talk is being video linked, so I'll just say hello to some of my collaborators that maybe are listening. Hello, Lucia. Hello, Roberto. Hello, Sam. Okay. What we've done recently, we've been actually organizing a workshop in Manchester called World Planets, and actually we are planning to publish an edited collection as a result of this research. And now I actually want to move into NATO. I think NATO is really a case in point for the analysis of how actually the geosciences developed during the Cold War period, partly because of specific political urgencies emerging in the context of transnational spaces like the NATO. I want to actually create a link. I want to bring together strategies and strategic postures that NATO adopted with specific research agenda pointing towards the development of the environmental sciences. But I mean, rather than bring it in a kind of direct line and say that one shaped the other, I'm actually making a point about the ways in which new strategies instigated conflicts within the alliance. NATO was not a place where everyone agreed. As that cartoon that you see there shows, NATO's choices about research and even environmental research were informed by NATO as a bureaucratic, political, and institutional environment, where by the word environment I mean milieu, context, context that ultimately created exactly that imbalance between people who were satisfied or dissatisfied about existing policies. And in that respect, I see NATO really as a context where there were a lot of tensions, primarily between the United States as country leading the alliance and its partners in Western Europe, between the military and political components of the alliance, and if we look just at research, between those researchers that were promoting original studies that would bring them closer to military organizations and those who had different political goals. So looking at NATO is not looking at a clear example of warping of clear research trajectories. It's more looking at really this hodgepodge of programs with people coming in, proposing something, finding oppositions, those opposing them, proposing something different. It is, I mean, I called it in my paper a hodgepodge of different programs. I can't describe it differently. Created in 1949, NATO's first strategy that was adopted was that obviously of massive retaliation, the idea that any Soviet aggression would be basically countered with a nuclear attack. That had obviously clear implication for the development of science and technology within NATO, as recalled, for instance, by the SACEUR, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, in 1961, when he clearly highlighted that science and that the military commanders at NATO relied upon scientists in order to build more powerful and flexible weapon systems. People like Nostad was obviously thinking primarily about nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, but actually defense. Defense was also extremely important. How you build defenses in a country, in a continent as big as Europe. And probably this, will lead me closer to some of the consideration that Matthew has put forward earlier, talking about the due line. Because of defense urgencies, people like Nostad needed around him very powerful defense research planners. People like Theodor von Karman, one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, as well as chairman of the NATO Aquest Committee, and Howard P. Robertson. Recently managed to come across his name and his work, and I've investigated more thoroughly. His influence on American policy during the Cold War period loomed large than anyone else probably at the time. He is really a key man in the military and research machinery of the US government, a member in advisory and leading roles into the CIA, the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, the National Academy of Sciences, and the RAND Corporation. He is everywhere. He's the founding father of operations research in America. Operations research being that branch that basically looks at ways in which scientific advice can actually change, modify, transform military operations. Robertson was the one, as the first Saussure scientific advisor, that really set the line for the development of defense research at NATO, but also informed more generally also NATO's development of fundamental or basic research. That's something that obviously, before I say that, people like Robertson and von Karman were concerned especially about how basically you could build defenses in Europe. And the answer was NATO has high. NATO has high is nothing but the extension of the due line, the distant early warning line, into continental Europe via a link including the remotest stations in the due line, Greenland, Iceland, and then into Britain. That is high basically guaranteed that any attack from the Soviet Union could be responded promptly by prompt communications from the far north in Norway down to Turkey, and that more than anything else, the detection of enemy forces could be straightforward. It is not thanks to things like the ACE High that basically people like Robertson and von Karman started thinking about the implications of environmental research. Why environmental research? Because that system works on radio signals. Radio signals propagate through the troposphere and the ionosphere. They are reflected by it. Whether the troposphere or the ionosphere work correctly, the radio signals will pass through, otherwise it doesn't pass through. And if it doesn't pass through, well, there's troubles. So people like Robertson started thinking very carefully about ways in which the environment, that is to say, that context, that medium that allow radio signals to travel across, could be studied more effectively. His opportunity came in 1958 with the organization of the Science Committee. Now, I don't have to recall here what the Science Committee was, given that John Krieger has written extensively about it in American Hegemony and in another paper on the subject. He was basically the promoter of original fundamental research within NATO, but and in particular, it was an effort to increase the supply of scientists within within Western Europe. That said, what I managed to figure out recently is that defense research urgencies were an integral part of the Science Committee program. And although, as you can see there, the original proposal was put forward by people working in the North Atlantic Council, so politicians, not military men, what happened eventually was that the plans, especially after the Sputnik, the plans for a program that would basically just be responding to fundamental research needs was turned into something completely different. That was thanks to a few men that worked quite a lot with Robertson First, the first NATO science advisor, Norman Ramsey, who actually was briefed by Robertson before leaving the United States to go to Paris, and informed quite clearly that although the plan was to develop fundamental research within the NATO context, military R&D falls in your bailiwick, meaning that ultimately his work was to bring together the urgencies put forward by the three wise men in the context of the Science Committee, before the organization of the Science Committee, together with military and defense research plans such as those that Robertson had in mind. Other two men critical to this operation were Isidore Rabi and Solid Zuckerman. Solid Zuckerman being the British representative, Rabi being the American representative. And I think when we look at Rabi, I think we can catch exactly what I was saying earlier about the flexibility of bringing together classified and unclassified knowledge in innovative ways. It was Rabi that put forward the proposition of making available to NATO the catalog, listing, and partly actually the information of the US Army Scientific Science and Technology Information Agency repository of papers that were actually available to the Americans for carrying forward research. So in order to make it possible for the Europeans to collaborate together with the Americans on defense research tasks, the Americans actually made available quite a lot of classified information and unclassified information for these purposes. Thanks to people like Ramsey, the Science Committee really sat at the center of a network of relationships that united also defense research operators, and that therefore brought together these two agendas that I described earlier. That is to say, the one of basically making sure that NATO would develop fundamental research, but that this fundamental research tied to defense agencies. There's something that shows that very clearly, and is an analysis, a statistical analysis of NATO, of the activities of the NATO Science Committee programs. While the science fellowship programs basically were designed mainly in an effort to make sure that Europe could provide specialized training to European scholars in prominent institutions. When we look instead at the research grants put forward by the NATO Science Committee, that is to say that strand of research that basically were projects that NATO scientists would put forward, we see that actually there is a significant prominence of environmental studies in this strand of program. And in particular, if we look at the ways in which, at the funding of this research in the first 5 years of activities of the Science Committee, you can see that especially between 1962 and 1964, more than half of the funding available for research grants to the Science Committee were made available mainly because to environmental sciences projects. Now, in the running of my research, I've started to analyze why is that? Why is that NATO would fund environmental research? And I found some answers, and probably I will conclude today just by showing you what answers I found. I think that, again, the theme of surveillance is really important in these research projects, and I'll present 3 cases here. First of all, I'll tell you something about NATO's investigations, NATO's promotion of oceanographic research. That's something that I've explored in another paper as well. When NATO set up a program of oceanographic surveys looking basically into areas, seas around Europe that could be analyzed and explored in terms of finding out more about currents, temperature, salinity, that kind of physical characteristics of the oceans, they did so consistently with an analysis basically of what would have been the movement of vessels leaving the Russian ports and actually traveling towards the Atlantic. And therefore, priority was given to what naval officers indicated as key points of transit for these vessels. And in particular, some like, say, for instance, Gibraltar or the Faroe-Shetland Channel. The reasoning behind it is that the analysis of these physical characteristics would have allowed to operate much more effectively the sonars, that is to say, the instruments that NATO was using to detect this kind of vessels. Another case that I think I've started investigating recently, I think is very important, is the so-called NATO satellite surveillance program. This was a program, and satellite surveillance is not my words, it's the actors' words. Is a word that basically aimed to investigate the actual positioning of objects in space by using tools such as radio telescopes, such as the one in Jodrell Bank. A project of this kind was started in 1957, immediately after the launch of Sputnik first by the US Air Force Cambridge Research Laboratory, and actually, in 1958 was taken by NATO, that actually set up a network of several laboratories across Europe collaborating together in the analysis of the objects in space. Now, the point that I want to make in relation to that, when I say objects in space, if it's unclear, I mean satellites. I mean Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, Sputnik 3, Cosmos. We are talking about basically these radio telescopes and other apparatus monitoring what is the position of Soviet satellites out there, basically almost constantly. So there's a clear surveillance agenda there. But where is we bring together the surveillance agenda and the scientific agenda? These were ionospheric research institutes. These were institutes concerned with the study of propagation of radio signals across the atmosphere. So there is where exactly you come to my point, which is to tell you that the knowledge of the environment is knowledge of the enemy in that respect. I'd say one last thing, which is the kind of project promoted by groups operating on meteorology and radiometeorology within NATO. These groups, which were subgroups of the Science Committee, as the Oceanography Group, basically promoted research projects that had to do really with the kind of problems that the setting up of a system like CEHC would encounter, and in particular how weather phenomena and would affect the functioning of that system. So for instance, one project set up by the Radiometeorology Committee was that of analyzing the weather impact on some of these links, such as those between Athens and Izmir, or for instance Nice and Pisa. Or for instance, an analysis of how major meteorological events phenomena would affect this functioning. A specific project was set up to analyze, for instance, the impacts of alpine cyclones on these kind of things. I don't think I have time to say much more. I've just described basically what it is, the first of the three, I think, strategic turns that takes place within NATO. The first turn is surveillance. The second, if I can just briefly recall it, is environmental warfare. By the beginning of the 1962, NATO is not just concerned with using the environment as a tool to put the enemy under surveillance. It is concerned with the ways in which it can weaponize the weather in order to make it possible for the enemy to be defeated by it. And interestingly enough, there's one actor that comes in, is Edward Teller. I don't think I need to recall who Edward Teller is here. Teller was extremely vocal. Yes, I've finished. Extremely vocal in recommending that basically NATO would invest in environmental warfare. One final turn, and then I conclude, is I think when we look at the politics of funding, of patronage that develops in NATO, and the ways in which several actors put together different opinions and ideas about the uses of the environment for surveillance, for control or warfare, we also have a sense of why some of the key protagonists, such as Rabi, at some point needed to find a way out from these conflicts between several operators within the alliance, and for instance came out with an interesting idea about launching NATO into the path of carrying forward environmental research of an environmental kind. as demonstrated by his words at the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the Science Committee. In the first 10 years of existence of the Science Committee, much changed in NATO's research agenda. The environment continued to be central, but for different specific priorities: surveillance, control, and finally, conservation or preservation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simone, also for presenting us the setup and the intellectual agenda of the TEOS project. An interesting project financed by an interesting agency, the latest child in European diversified landscape of fostering integrated research and in this case also the humanities, the European Research Council. It opened up a space for the humanities, and that's good news. Now, to my comment, for those of us who are, well, in a way, oscillating between environmental history and history of science and technology, we have to admit that these two fields are still quite separated. They don't talk that much to each other, at least not that much as we hope for. Of course, there are colleagues like Matthias Heimann, Jim Fleming, and of course, Ron, who have been successfully working to bridge the gap between these two subdisciplines of history. But I have to say there are colleagues like Greg Midman who constantly argue that there's much to gain from this. But I have to say from my own experience from the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, where we defined environmental knowledge as one of 6 research foci, there are not that many studies, or let's say in this case, fellows who successfully demonstrated to us that, let's say, a history of environmental knowledge can be successfully not only conceptualized, but also narrated. So there's much to gain, and all the more we should welcome sessions like this one here, which aim at finding integrated perspectives to, as I said, to bridge the gap between history of science and technology on the one hand and environmental history on the other hand. I can't resist from reiterating what Jessica already said. We have been gathering here also in a way to reassess Paul Forman's thesis number 2. Number 1 has been recessed already in a conference some years ago at University of British Columbia. Now we've been gathering here to reconceptualize Cold War studies, Cold War history of science, as we heard, or, as I said, to reassess Paul Forman's thesis, namely that the sciences were warped by the logic of the military, by the logic of the national security state. And I'm pretty sure that Paul, if he were still in the room, would be tempted to intervene here at this point. But let us stick for this moment to this interpretation of his seminal paper of 1987, because it's exactly the main argument that scholars have gained from his paper. Maybe not all the colleagues, but most of the colleagues in the field of history of science and also environmental history, and more so the colleagues outside of our narrow disciplinary environments in general history, for example. Thus, this conference can be understood to follow the same agenda as I said, the earlier conference on the Forman thesis number 1. Now, what have we gained from these 3 papers in light of Paul Forman's thesis on the impact of the Cold War on, in this case, the course of the environmental sciences during the Cold War? I think we have gained a lot. Let me recall the major findings of these 3 papers as far as I have read them. I'll take the papers in their reverse order and thus begin with Simone, who basically showed that NATO developed into a kind of important factor in fostering studies on the environment since the late 1950s already. Interestingly enough, and we will come back to this issue in a minute, especially in Western Europe. It is important to note that Simone is not arguing that NATO shaped the scientific community's research agendas, but not even in the geosciences, which were particularly deeply impacted by the Cold War. Simone rather stresses the tensions between the various actors groups involved in the setting of NATO's research programs. Tensions existed not just between the US and its allies in Western Europe, and between NATO's military and civil branches, but also within the scientific communities involved, particularly between experts who were in line with the goals of the military authorities and experts who aimed at strengthening either the autonomy of science in defining their own ends or at promoting other political agendas, such as to gain environmental data, environmentally related data to overcome the growing problems of pollution and environmental degradation. There was no homogeneity in the agenda-setting business, neither on the side of the military nor on the side of the scientists. Rather, there were multiple tensions, and these tensions could even lead, as in this case, to the dissolution of institutions, the NATO's subcommittee on oceanography. In the early 1970s, then, with environmental politics coming to the fore of international relations, NATO, with its newly established panels on ecosciences and marine sciences, developed into a kind of driver, let's say, a driver of environmental sciences. Now, my question to Simone would be, what could possibly be gained from changing the primary perspective within this, I would say, transatlantic story, namely by shifting the focus from the US to Western Europe? Would this story then be another case of unintended consequences, namely that US politics aiming at stabilizing its hegemony position finally fostered European integration? Or did Europe develop its leadership position in many fields of environmental sciences, including the geosciences, basically independently from this US context? I'm now turning to Matthew's papers, which also figures the US next to neighboring Canada center stage. Much like Simone's paper, it is another Cold War story of political aims to gain full control over space and territoriality. In particular, to gain control on the oceans and on the Arctic as the final frontiers that had still left being open despite all efforts of scientists to close it. And I think it would be very rewarding to retell this story also as a kind of effort to close this frontier, this open frontier, to embark on the concept of frontiers and the closure of frontiers. Matthew's case of the distant early warning line can be understood as efforts to close this frontier, as I said, for the north of the globe, a chain of stations stretching from Alaska to Greenland. This both gigantic and enormously challenging program militarized the Arctic and transformed the sciences of logistics. As a kind of spin-off, the scientists and engineers involved in the projects collected environmental data that later were also of use for civil purposes. The overall program, however, was not at all an environmental friendly one. To the contrary, it transformed great parts of the Arctic landscapes into military and industrial scapes, spotted by oil barrels and garbage of all sorts. And here comes my question to Matthew. No doubt it makes much sense to narrate this story of environmental decline, I would say, in the Arctic North by referring to Rob Nixon's seminal, really interesting concept of slow violence, an almost invisible violence that in the end led to the destruction of indigenous peoples' environments, in this case, Inuits' environments. What could be gained if one could enrich the story with another conceptual framework, namely the framework of waste studies? This framework could, for example, show how things were made into waste, and that different people and different peoples had a different understanding of things and waste that were things that finally ended up in waste, in the social construction of waste. So I think that would be a rewarding effort. The Dewline story could also be told as a post-colonial story, which is the primary angle of Perrin's paper. His bold paper aims at no less than a reinterpretation of the meanwhile classic story of the first image of the blue marble, shot by Apollo 17 and then released by NATO in 1972, which invigorated the formation of environmental movements all over the globe, resulted from the Cold War context to the race of the moon. Perrin rather shows that the idea of the fragile spaceship Earth was basically constructed within UN agencies, transnational communities of experts which often were dominated by European scientists. The theories, practices, and also norms and values of these scientists mostly resulted from the context of decolonization, a process that, of course, went parallel and was entangled with the Cold War, but nevertheless followed its own temporal rhythms and its own had its own cognitive fundaments. US scientists, too, were engaged in this story, in this history of decolonization. In doing so, they ran into conflicts with their US national agendas and often developed into true believers of scientific internationalism. Here comes my question for Perrin. Much like John, I do think it is time to remap the geographies of scientific competition and cooperation, of conflict and collaboration in the Cold War and post-Cold War context. In doing so, we would identify multiple dimensions of transnational corporations, not at least an often underestimated colonial dimension, but many other dimensions as well, the transatlantic dimension, bilateral dimensions, blah, 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 a lot of other dimensions which are in that story, but in your case a bit hidden, so to speak, and to bring these other dimensions of the geography of European and transnational collaboration to the fore would be rewarding. Now these three papers don't talk that much to each other, at least not explicitly, but implicitly they do, I would think. And for myself, I've identified a number of, let's say, overarching subjects and questions, which I only can lay out here to you. And I will end up by just throwing in one, elaborating on one further question. I lay out 6 here just very quickly. The first one, which I find very interesting one, is the transformation of landscapes. We have seen that with the Arctic North, which was very much transformed by the military, by these efforts of both military and civilian agencies to get a grips of the North to control this open space. So transformations of landscapes is an overarching issue which also comes up in the other 2 stories. Another one would be the formation of international environmental movements in the 60s and particularly in the 1970s, sponsored as a resulting from, say, responses to military efforts, to Cold War context, NGOs, governance, structures, new structures, and also new cultural perceptions of nature-culture relations. Thirdly, the formation and transformation of scientific disciplines and fields, which resulted from this process. We've heard about that, the transformation of oceanography from a context which was very much driven by the logics of the military into one which was, in a way, co-shaped by military and civilian interest. A fourth perspective is the inextricable connections between nationalism and transnationalism, internationalism, in the formation both of the use and the production and the use of knowledge. The fifth one is this kind of epic struggle, of course, about the definition power on techno-scientific agendas. The agenda-setting question, who is in control of this struggle between, say, different logics in setting the agendas. And my personal favorite is someone who just sent in a book manuscript called Building Europe on Expertise. The question, in what way European experts played a crucial role here, and that what you called the encounter of experts, the personal encounters and the circulation of knowledge which resulted from this vast network of encounterings in the 70s, 80s, and after the Cold War. But my most important question, I think, would be, I mean, you've been talking of high modernism, a concept which is very much debated and which is very much relevant, I would say, here, because the rationale, which seems to be dominant in all three stories, is that state authorities, national authorities tried to gain control over the wider space in which they acted, be it the national space, be it transnational space. So the national security state and the obsession with ensuring the national security state is in the middle of what you all was telling us. And this in a way, can be framed in the idea of high modernism, which would enlarge the time frame here, and John was referring to this. So what is specific to the Cold War context here? Is it a specific Cold War story, or can it be framed differently if we put it in this concept of high modernism? That would be my question to all three of you. Thank you. Maybe a second for each of you, so to speak, to respond, and then we open the floor.
I hope I've given the image of the relation between the United States and Western European countries as really problematic, to say the least. I think perhaps we should also revise to some extent the description of American hegemony as a kind of overarching concept. I think what European countries perceived as way forward in terms of economic and social development was ultimately hijacked by American strategic urgencies and defense needs. So in a sense, Europe was put to work in the ways in which the Americans wanted, but that doesn't mean that this was a straightforward process or a process that could be easily co-produced, to say Krieger's words. It was a problematic process, and I think investigating these problems is helpful. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you for the commentary. It's very interesting, and especially for your question to me, which is, I said regional tensions were more important in many ways in the programmatic operations of the United Nations organizations, which refers exactly to what you're talking about with a more complex transnational geography, because tensions between, say, India and Pakistan, in terms of, just as an example, Pakistan, the head of the Weather Bureau in Pakistan wanted to have an international cartographic surveying workshop in Pakistan, and it was going to be for the South Asian region. And it was built up and it was planned, and then the Pakistan military said, no, this is not going to go forward. We're not going to have a bunch of Indians on our territory, practicing their cartographic skills in Kedah. That's just not a realistic thing. And over you see those sorts of more regional tensions, especially in the Middle East, out in the wake of the Suez crisis, for example. One of the great triumphs of the Natural Sciences Department is the first French expert to work in Egypt is a soil scientist who comes there. And there's many of these sorts of more regional tensions that animate and shape the kind of science that's being performed there. I also want to say just a word on the internationalism and transnationalism, which you brought up, which is that I think that what you see and what I try and talk about with this 3 UNs concept is this is a space which is particularly interesting because you see the international and the transnational really meeting in this space. The international being the formal governmental interactions and the transnational being everything else. And it often the agenda is set by this sort of transnational community in surprising ways, I would say.
Thanks very much for your comments and questions. I do need to think about waste more deeply, and I would only say here that I'm quite interested in the ways in which this wasted landscape is very, very similar to other sites for military testing, experimentation, development, places like the Nevada test site, has been made into something that is productive for the local economy. So it's waste itself now that is generating jobs for indigenous people in the North. And I think that's fascinating and quite troubling. With respect briefly, to high modernism, something that fascinates me a great deal, perhaps too much. I think one of the ways in which we can bring it together with the Cold War is strictly by thinking about the entanglements of the military with high modernism and specific ways in which, in my case, studying the Department of Defense, how it, in all of its complexity, thought about high modernism vis-a-vis its specific large-scale projects.
We've started half an hour late, but can we have 15 more minutes so that we do have 20 minutes or so for discussion? And I invite you to come up with your questions. Ron is first, that makes sense.
Thanks very much, and this is as much a... Thank you. Ron Dole, Florida State University. I want to thank the panel for pulling together various strands of the environmental sciences. And one of the things to add to the good list that Helmut, you've already produced here on where this all comes together and the questions that it raises, there's distinct patrons and different ethos, different mentalities on the part of these different communities that we see as parts of the environmental sciences, different trajectories. I find it fascinating, and it follows on Simone's presentation, that as late as the late 1960s, when President Lyndon Johnson asks his science advisor about the environmental sciences and gets a response, it's entirely the physical branches, not the biological parts that come in. I think I'm asking, perhaps pleading for, an addition to transnational histories, that we think in this context of transdisciplinary histories so that we can tease out better the tensions and the issues that we're seeing so vividly illustrated in sessions like this.
Thank you. We will bundle 3 or 4 questions and then give you the opportunity to respond and pick and choose whatever you find relevant from your perspective. So who's next, please?
Hi, I'm Karen Rader from Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm interested, I feel like I'm learning so much already just from this morning session, but just this theme of sort of remapping geographies, in particular this session focusing on national and trans or international geographies, as well as scientific expertise and political action, sort of remapping those boundaries. But one that seems to be not yet fully unpacked, and particularly in light of your comments, Helmut, about sort of the formation of international environmental movements, is boundaries between scientific expertise and popular or public knowledge. So I'm wondering if any of you have any kind of comments related to that, because I haven't heard that aspect of your stories drawn out more fully.
John?
I'm John Krieger from Georgia Tech. So this is a remark on both Piran and Simone's paper. I tend to be so dominated by the national narratives during the Cold War that I see these institutions like the NATO Science Committee and perhaps some of your UN committees as solutions in search of a problem, because so much is dominated by national state interest. So your example of India and Pakistan is a perfect example. I mean, they have to carve out a space in which they can define problems and tackle things internationally because they're allowed to by nation states which sort of shed off for certain kinds of information because they don't really need them or want them particularly, and outsource them, if you like, to these institutions. And then when they find this information is becoming pertinent to direct national interest, they tend to balk at what they've done. And that makes me think, that's not a question, that's just an observation, a way of thinking about these things and how they insert themselves in a world in which they have to define a role for themselves. And it's very difficult to do that, to define problems and missions for themselves which will be durable, which is often why they seem to fail, because basically failure is built into it in a way, because insofar as the nation state is such a dominant player for so much of the Cold War. But this leads me to a question to you, Simone. Knowledge of the environment is knowledge of the enemy. Sounds like an over-rationalization of what is going on. I mean, knowledge of the environment is something that we have to rationalize and make sense of in terms of what we're doing in NATO and what NATO's mission is. But if I think of, and of course the cases you give are excellent, Mosby, for example, with his oceanography, it's a wonderful example. Morse with his operations research. These are very definite NATO kind of things. There's a lot going on inside NATO that has actually no direct pertinence to the enemy. It's just there because NATO's got the money, not very much, and has to do something with it. And when you think about the way the NATO Science Committee is formed, which is to train manpower for freedom, which is the way it's defined in this panic moment after Sputnik, it's a very diffuse kind of agenda. So I wonder if you're not imposing too tight an agenda on what's actually happening inside these institutions, taking the rhetoric too seriously.
Okay, let's have one or two more questions and then opportunity to respond.
S.M. Amade, Ohio State University, and this question is directed to Perrin and to Simone for the most part. I'm really interested that at the same time that there's this idea that there's plurality and diversity between the national security state and attaining knowledge for command and control on the one hand, but then in Perrin, in your paper, there's the finite Earth, and there's a sort of a hopeful moment leading to 1972 and the blue Earth. And in Simone, there's the idea that there's diversity underneath the quest in Western Europe to use knowledge to understand the enemy. In my own research, it seems as though the national security state always wins over those two agendas, and yet in your papers, there seemed to be this emphasis on the more positive or constructive view. So I wonder if you can say something about, do you think the national security state always wins? And I guess this connects to the question about high modernism and national security.
Okay, that's it for the moment. Who wants to start? Simone, you've been asked.
Right, I'll just very briefly comment on what Ron was saying. Obviously, disciplinary boundaries are extremely important shift between disciplines, and especially between a more, say, physical-oriented type of research towards more biology-oriented type of research is absolutely essential to be considered here. And obviously, I couldn't do it in greater detail in the context of my paper. So yes, I mean, I think it is important to stress the interplay. And perhaps, but I think here we're really going to Foreman's territory and not mine. I mean, I'm just trying to map this set of relations. I think Foreman, for instance, is much more interested in the cultural implications of these forms of patronage. And in particular, to extend on his work, I think we should probably consider ways in which certain type of research that these days is considered by the oceanographers themselves extremely boring. They used to say that has to do just with measurements, data recording, nothing more than that. Is actually was at the heart of what it was the Cold War project for some branches of the earth sciences. Oceanographers these days have a much more, I think, set of sophisticated tools to understand and to chart certain aspects of the sea, that exactly because they are not tied anymore to Cold War urgencies. As for the other issues, more than public knowledge, to answer to your question, I would actually think about the interplay of certain, very hierarchical, very powerful organizations such as NATO with what's happened outside, grassroots movements. I'm thinking about 1968, I'm thinking about what happens, and the need, the urgency to give a response to what happened outside in order to retain control, retain power. And in a sense, I see some of the answers, even in the promotion of certain branches of the environmental sciences, as responses from above to something happen, if you want, from below. NATO Science Committee program was diffused. I don't think it was diffused. It was diversified, deliberately diversified to accommodate to different agendas. One was the agenda coming out from the North Atlantic Council. The other was the agenda coming out from the military organizations within, operating within NATO. It wasn't a result that was diffused. It was mixed, deliberately mixed to adjust to the different concerns. I think that's the point. That said, you're absolutely right. NATO also sponsored research on quantum physics, on astronomy, on operations research, on human factors. The program ultimately accommodated a lot of different interests. I'm trying to find the thread. I think I found a thread specifically for the environmental sciences. I'm not saying that the thread that I'm finding for the environmental sciences should be in a sense, adopted to explain the sponsorship of NATO science more generally. It was one of many aspects. And I think there was something said from that. Yes, about diversification. I think this diversification was ultimately a response to specific strategic urgencies. The people who were funded by NATO, the kind of programs that were funded by NATO clearly showed to me that there was a plot behind it, a clear plot that had to do with defense needs, defense urgencies. That said, I'm looking just at one area. And I mean, again, I could go on and even tell you about, research projects on fossils or all sorts of other things, because there was even that kind of research. But I mean, you can find the same actors, the same people being funded, people who were attached to Aquest, for instance, and other institutions, and play a crucial role in having their programs approved. So national security was there, was important, and one could find a thread within many different threads.
To Karen's point about popular knowledge is very interesting, especially in the UNESCO context, because in the beginning it sees itself as sort of the people's organization, and its explicit goal is to create world citizenship, which is going to be engaging people, and also in terms of coming out of the kind of New Deal era, the global New Deal era of the 1930s, many experts came in with a mentality that was very different than the sort of high modernism that Scott has written about, which was a combining of lay research and expertise in terms of understanding landscapes and how they're useful and used. And so in some of these mapping projects, especially in the coming out of the late New Deal in the United States, but also in colonial context, and Helen Tilley's book recently on colonial science talks about this too, a real explicit engagement with creating teams of farmers on the ground or people in the towns working with sociologists or rural sociologists or soil scientists themselves to create these maps, to create the boundaries, and to work that way. That is largely a late 40s, early 50s kind of moment, and community development is a really ongoing thing in the 1950s that's about development with an eye of social and political development and getting villages to recognize their identity as a common corporate entity. And it doesn't really win out. And it speaks sort of what Sonia's talking about. Does the national security state always win? I would put it a little differently. I would say that national development always wins, that the national government in these situations tends to win out, and that development becomes a means of building national identities, and a program like community development that's about recognizing village interests and local interests at that level, or appreciating the diversity of knowledge, can, if it's successful, actually run counter to the main goal of creating a nation out of these third world countries that have very little in common sometimes, except for a history of colonial resistance. To John's point about did this all amount to anything anyway, really? Kind of. Which is something that I have to come up against quite a bit. I do think that it mattered, and I think that whenever people in the media, politicians, and experts themselves turn to global comparative research, international comparative research, or understanding global environments, their sources are often connected to UN projects that were usually coordinated, and it's sort of it's not an operational thing, but it required that sort of international cooperation to produce global data on that level. And more importantly and subtly, I think it created common narratives, development narratives that were shared widely across the world and allowed for some sort of common projects. And you have to remember that the Cold War is not just a war of nuclear weapons. It's a war for hearts and minds. It's a war about development itself. So how do you keep track of who's winning this war? It's through statistics and of standards of livings, of GDP and these sorts of things. And the UN is incredibly important in standardizing those categories and being able to allow people to keep track. I do want to make one comment on high modernism, because actually much of my book is a kind of a critique of high modernism as a concept. And that's just that there is a great dispersal of power in the programs that I'm looking at. It's not necessarily about centralization of authority in that way that Scott has written so much about, and that if you follow the military patronage, it seems very clear. And the stuff I'm writing about, this ethos of participatory democracy, creating knowledge, is much more apparent. And in the early period, it's this, following Jessica's advice, I do draw on Jess Gilbert, a rural sociologist's idea of low modernism, of more small-scale kind of projects that you can really see happening in the UN context.
Thanks, Ron. I would just say it's interesting to think about the line in the case of a disciplinary history, because it's a military project, it's an industrial project, and it is to some extent an academic project. Certainly by the time social scientists and others go up to effectively study the ongoing construction of the line itself and its effect on local environments and local communities. And perhaps the most significant discipline, if you like, if you can even call it that, in the line case is engineering, which is a very strange and blurry and messy one. And the engineers, I mean, again, thinking kind of critically, but also trying to follow on from some of the other scholarship on high modernism, the engineers serve, I don't know the low modernism idea, but they serve as a kind of high modernist local knowledge form. They're the sort of translators from the high to the low, if you like, through site-specific studies and so on. And just to respond to your question, Karen, about public knowledge, it's certainly very important in this case, because you have a real parallel between the military interest in the north and, of course, widespread public interest in things Arctic during this time. There's an exact match. So how does this actually play out in terms of the kind of public knowledge that's being widespread, that's spreading widely across, certainly in Canada and the United States? Well, there's an immense interest in the north, and yet there's a lot of control over who gets to generate this public knowledge. And so communities of experts, particularly in the Arctic Institute of North America, through the Canadian government, are created, relatively small communities who then comment extensively on all things Arctic. They become sort of generic regional experts, almost Arctic area studies people, who can then show up in the newspaper to speak about the line within the larger context of northern development, and it is very much a development story. So these questions of expanded interest in the north, of expanded access to northern knowledge, and yet at the same time you have a fairly closed community of those who can speak on behalf of the north, and it's only really by the early 1960s that you see a different kind of widespread public knowledge of the north coming about, including from growing indigenous resistance to militarization, other kinds of development, but also environmentalism appears rather late, I would say, on the stage, particularly through things like Project Chariot, of course, in Alaska, and then other kinds of developments in Canada in the 1960s.
Okay, I'm tempted to throw in the idea of turning points in the history of the Cold War, or the interrelations of Cold War sciences and environmental history. And we have heard of a lot of candidates for such turning points, like the late 50s with the Sputnik shock that resonated and prompted responses. We've heard of the mid-1960s when NATO changed their strategies. We've heard of the early 70s, 72 in particular, and of course the end of the Cold War. Maybe we have this question of turning points. We keep that question of turning points in mind when we discuss later subjects in the conference. As for now, we've used up our time. Thanks to all three panelists, and thanks for your patience, and sorry for cutting in your lunch break.